Actually, what we did also in the SIENNA project on work package 2 that deals with the genomics is to try to develop a self-assessment guide. And the reason for this I will provide shortly. And Amal has already said a little bit about the kind of the lack of codes and specification on what to do with regard to what we have in compassionate treatment or experimental treatment. And just to remind you that in many of these genomic applications that we have seen during the years that Anna also told us about, Anna Falk, in the beginning, if you take, for example, gene therapy that started in the 70s, some of these projects were really starting with patients, but not as sort of research project, but a kind of experimental treatment project. Of course, there was a lot of background science on it with the animal experimentation, but not always. So some of this went wrong, some of this went terribly wrong. It depended a little bit on the context. So if you have alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, then if you could manipulate the genes behind that enzyme, it was sufficient to have an improvement in, say, 10% of the immune response, and then that would be good. For other cases, like the SCID, the severe combined immunodeficiency syndrome, there was another problem related to the triggering of oncogenes when you inserted new genes. So we have seen during the history here that some of these introduction of new genomic technologies has come sort of sidewise. They have not been part of regular research projects. They have been part of researchers, being also clinicians doing experimental treatment. And of course, it must be remembered that compassionate treatment must always be an option in a clinical setting. If you have a patient that we have run out of all kinds of treatment, and there is a possibility to try say on a child in cancer, a treatment that has been approved only so far on adults, and you are allowed to try that if you have sort of good science background, as long as you can take it, you can do that, and that should of course be permitted. But there are some cases in the history of genomic technologies where we really have been moving too fast and not have precautions, and that is why we also propose this idea of a patient ombudsman. What we have seen is that when I talk with ethical review boards, national health authorities, these examples are not very frequent, but they happen. They come beside the ordinary ethical review system. They are not really part of clinical practice, and it's too few cases for even on a national basis to have a specific ethical review board. And that is why we are proposing that on a national level, on international level, European or international, one could have a sort of a system with a patient ombudsman. We will try to get that published hopefully very soon so that you can read it. What one should remember though is that all those cases where there was some premature development, they have now moved on. And they are now moving into sort of ordinary treatment. So for gene therapy, for example, there are examples of established treatment for several rare disorders. There are clinical trials going on. So it's going into mainstream medical science. So one should remember that when one look into this, one should take precautions not to sort of throw out the baby with the bathtub water, as we say, but also make possible the potential future use, and that is a way forward. So what we are proposing here is a way, all funding agencies are setting up sort of ethical assessment protocols. We have all been filling them in many times, and I think they're very important. It helps you to identify important ethical points, and you set sort of check your certain bullet point that you have checked this and that and that. What we are trying to do here is that we see that it's a little bit in line with what Anna Falk said in the beginning, that we need to have some kind of reflection from researchers and all the way to from master level to senior levels. And in the ordinance that we have in the for example, the high school ordinance, the legal document regulating university and university teaching and research in Sweden, it clearly states that there should be an ethical awareness all the way down to individual researchers related to their scientific work. So there must be a possibility to reflect on ethical aspects. It's a little bit too late if one is already at the application stage and then call in for ethical experts or ethical review committees. One must be able to look into this in advance. So that is why we have proposed this sort of tool for ethical self-assessment, and there are some other reasons behind doing that. And we know from different developments in technology, for example, in nanotechnology, when those first nanotubes came in, and you can use them for medical research and also for medical treatment, because you can be able to bypass, for example, the human brain, the blood-brain barrier, and you can insert medicine and drugs. The scientists that developed those, they saw quite soon that these small nanotubes, they look very much like asbestos molecules, and that can be very harmful to individuals, to human beings, not only to human beings, but to human beings, particularly in this case. So they started on parallel to try to investigate the risk to human beings while they were developing the technologies. And this kind of precautionary approach is something that I think we need in other areas as well. So if I move on, a problem from community word point of view is that it's a risk that ethical assessment becomes a one-time event. You ticket some predefined and generally defined boxes, and ethics becomes a fait accompli. Something that you have done. When you have put in this, then it's done, then you can leave. Then you can continue with your work. A fait accompli rather than as a continuous reflection about one as science develops and as societies change. The real nature of doing science is that science changes all the time and give new challenges to ethical review and what to do and what not to do. So we think that one needs to have a practical tool that could be of use in training for research ethics, for use by research projects and scientists setting up projects, for use by ethics committees for sure, as funding agencies. And this is the background of this, and it's a kind of a testimony from myself being around in this area now. I'm a senior professor and have been around for quite many years by now. One of the premises behind this tool for ethical self-assessment is the need about balancing. And I think Olga Torstosov was relating to that when she pointed out the different sort of human rights declarations that both pointed to sort of protection of privacy and the protection of the right to benefit from medical treatment, from prevention and so on. The same from Tamara, who was pointing at the importance to protect, but also the importance to provide data in registries and so on that could be used for research. So it's about balancing scientific and clinical benefits versus risk of harm, intrusion, or private spheres. And there is a deficit, a lack of awareness in moral thinking that sometimes we think when new technologies come that you are sort of more on the safe side if you say immediately no. So no brings you sort of better on the more safe side, but that's blatantly wrong. because whether you say no or yes, you are equally responsible for the consequences. If you say no, you may forego important benefits, important alleviation of risks and threats of harm to patients or others. If you say yes too rapidly, then you're equally responsible for things that maybe go wrong because you haven't thought about the consequences. You haven't done enough efforts to mitigate risks that you have identified. So this important thing here is to make a balance, and current and future patients are the key interest. So what we said, and this is just my collection of old, not antiquated, but very well established principles that could be help thinking around science and science projects by scientists themselves. To identify those current and future parties who may be stakeholders in relation to research. That might sometimes be very difficult, but it might be patients, of course, if it's medical research. It might be future patients. Tamara told us about the importance of relatives that were exposed to risk due to hereditary nature of the cancer and so on. And there might be others that have stakes in this. So you describe the interest of each defined type of stakeholder, and then you have to describe if and how interest may come into conflict with each other. And I think that is one of the most important, because this is about balancing. There might be, of course, a possibility that as we have been discussed quite openly during the last 3, 4, 5 years even, that even de-identified personal data may be possible to identify if you have enough sources, enough data power, and if you have available that needed some kind of source of some database that you have access to. So there is a risk of identification even of the identified data. However, and that should be taken, of course, to be acknowledged. However, in many cases, there's also a risk of not being able to identify an individual based on the data. We see that in rare disease research, where if you're setting up a study with rare disease patients, and for rare diseases, because there are, as the word says, very few people that are able, so you have to collect, you have to pull data from various sources, pull data from various clinical studies. And when you do that, you need to know if this is the same patient who have received 10 treatments, or if these are 10 patients who have received different treatments. And you need to maybe to identify, to locate the individuals. So you can't make it impossible to identify individuals. And you have to find solutions to do that. And there are solutions to do that in order to be able to protect data from unauthorized use. But there is a balance. There might still be a risk. And the usual outcome of this should then be, and it's also that you can't guarantee to a patient that this data will only be and always be inaccessible for anyone else. But you can make sure, and you can inform in the informed consent, that we have provided this and these different protection measures. We can't guarantee that no one will ever hack this. There is data on the possibility to hack the identity data, and they show that this is very rare, and the data has shown that the reviews on those data have shown that it may be possible, but at those instances when it was possible, the data was not protected according to the standards, the current standards available by data. So I will just give an example, because we have been working together with scientists regarding ethical review for many years. And this was a geneticist that came to me in my office in Uppsala. She was working with issues related to vascularization of tumors and trying to understand the process of vascularization. If there was a possibility to provide some treatment sort of to cut off the vascularization and then the nourishment of the tumor and stop it from growing. She was to investigate the role of RNA, ribonucleic acid here, in the vascularization process of tumors. And she was going to use previously collected biospecimens, samples from patients that had cancer. And those samples had been donated to, in this case, was Uppsala Biobank. They were provided by the physicians, the doctors in case, and so they were already in the biobank. The only data she needed to accompany the sample was the sex of the individual and the source of the data, so to say, the kind of tumor that it was coming from, nothing else. So she wrote the project proposal and application for ethical review, and the ethical review board came back to her and said, well, these are very sensitive issues, so there's a privacy concern here. So we think that you need to go back based on the respect for privacy and ask each individual patient from whom the sample comes. And then she came to us and she was quite furious, and we understood her. If she should have done what the ethical review board said, it had implied that she had to go to the biobank, get the identity of the doctors who had submitted the samples, via the doctors, get the identity of the patients to whom their samples belonged, and also for those patients who were dead, get the identity of their relatives, and then ask them about the permission to do research. And everyone understands that this procedure, that was an implication of the Ethics Review Board decision, would have constituted a massive invasion of privacy. So we managed to convince, we wrote an appeal, and we managed to convince the Ethics Review Board that there are different interests at balance here. And of course, privacy is important, but it serves sometimes to get in the way of other concerns. And in this case, there was another kind of privacy involved if they had been following. So this is an example of the need to balance, and it goes for researchers as well as for ethical review boards. So this is what we do. And then we have suggested that the basic for this tool is quite straightforward. It's a collection from the literature and from what we have been using for many years in research ethics. The principle of autonomy. Amal said in her triangle in the priority order, the respect for person was the most important. So the considered principle of autonomy. And then in the tool, we are just suggesting a set of questions that the researcher or the reviewer should ask themselves. Now, has the research subject sufficient cognitive capacity to understand? Being invited to a research project, taking part in a research project, an intervention project, a data project, for example, or whatever it is, have they a capacity to understand or not? If not, is there someone who can act as a trusted proxy? Usually for cognitively decapacitated, or as for children, so we have such a system in place. The next question, have you disclosed all relevant facts? We have in the history of research ethics examples of patients who have, if not misled, not been properly informed about the relevant facts regarding potential benefits and potential risks, and both indirect and direct risk, and possible and planned mitigation of risk. So do they understand, and how do you ensure that understanding is sufficient? A set of other questions regarding the principle of autonomy is participation voluntary, and how do you ensure voluntariness? This might be problematic, but of course the usual way we do that for clinical studies is that we ensure and must make possible for a patient to at any time say no and withdraw consent without any sort of repercussions or any consequences regarding the treatment. And as we all know, the major sort of moral outrage violation during the Nazis was not that they were inflicting risks on research subjects, but that the research subjects were not free to say no, to walk away. So that is where the principle of freely and voluntary informed consent came in the first place. So how will the appropriate information and consent procedures look like? Is there an effective means to withdraw participation? And how will they do that? That is very important. The second principle is the principle of non-maleficence, and it goes all the way back to the Hippocratic Oath. Above all, try not to do harm. We know that it has to be balanced against beneficence, but you have to think about if there are any foreseen risk of direct or indirect harms, physical, psychological, privacy-related, short-term, long-term, associated with your project or intervention, or whatever it is. And since there is no risk-free society ever, and in particular not in genetic research, in genomic research, how you must think about how these risks may be mitigated, if so, and how. Is there a possibility to minimize harm while still answering the research question? We learned that in animal research that for a long time, that sometimes you can try to minimize the number of animals needed. You can try to replace an animal higher up in the series with a lower series of animals. You might even do a computer model. So, do you see any potential long-term risk related to the new knowledge that will be required through the project? I mean, so how may these be assessed and mitigated? So again, this is one example, is the nanotubes, to be able to see around the corner. And those people who are best able to do that are the researchers themselves. We ethicists, philosophers, social scientists, lawyers, we are not equipped to see around the corner in the way that scientists. If you look into what Anna Falk told us, she had a historical course which she described, which she was basing her current sort of interpretation on the research on. So they are the one equipped to think around the corner, and they should be encouraged to do that maybe a little bit often than they do. And then the other thing that but the principle of maleficence is to be balanced against the principle of beneficence. So you have to describe and think over what are the indirect benefits, direct benefits, short-term and long-term from this project. Who are the beneficiaries? Are the beneficiaries the same as those facing the risk of harm? That's not always the case, but sometimes the case. We have that problem related to, of course, the fundamental problem in research ethics that you do research in individuals that might not benefit themselves from the research, but it will be something of use for later patients. How may the balance of benefits and risk of harm be justified? How is this communicated to research participants and so on? So just to make this a little bit shorter now and wrap it up, we are doing the same with the principle of justice, respect for privacy, the principle of reciprocity. That is a principle related to that we are engaging patients. We are very poor in giving feedback to patients about the results of research, and we should improve that. Reciprocity is also about respecting the contribution, the intellectual contributions from institutions and so. The principle of freedom for scientific inquiry. The problem regarding data protection is, in my view, not that we don't have sufficient amount of data. The problem is that data is not shared, that people who are collecting data are sitting on them. We have several examples of that, instead of having others from different scientific points of view make use of the data to make new innovations.